All right, let's talk about some of Plato's major ideas, including, first and foremost, of course, Plato's Forms. This is where I get to introduce my soon-to-be famous diagram of Plato's Forms. And what I have here is really just a visual depiction of the divided line metaphor that we get in the Republic. And the way that this came about is that I was in graduate school. I was trying to, put everything all at once in front of me in a single picture so that I could get it, in my head and understand things. I like to have single diagrams for things that encapsulate everything. And it turned out to be so spectacularly useful to me that not only did I use it for that, but I also used it when I teach Plato, and I use it when I teach others who were even influenced by Plato. And so it's something that I found myself referring to over and over again, and I want to offer it to everyone. So the way that this works is very simple. So up is good, down is bad. That's a usual metaphor that we're accustomed to dealing with thanks to, of course, Lakoff and Johnson for pointing out the universality of such a metaphor. But with Plato, what we have literally here is a sliding scale of being. So the things at the top end of the scale and the great chain of being, the things at the top end literally have more existence. They are more real and they have more existence, more being than the things at the lower end of the scale. And what we have here is visually and physically in some ways a depiction of the ancient cosmos, in the sense that down here you have the earthly realm. This is the terrestrial realm of things. This is where we have manifestations of individual things, individual horses, individual tables and chairs and people and forks and knives and spoons and sporks, and it's great. Those things have a certain amount of reality. But what's a little counterintuitive to us, I think, and what Plato is telling us, is that the ideas of things, the eidos, the forms, literally have more being than the individuals themselves. That takes us a little bit to wrap our heads around. So there are two reasons for this that are compelling, I think. The first is rooted in polytheism itself. So polytheism in general is it's a form of religion and thinking, and certainly was the case with ancient Greece, that was concerned with the archetypal. It was concerned with what repeats. It was concerned with a cyclical version of history. In other words, history is something that repeats over and over again. And so the dawning of each new day and each new year is just a repetition of the same. It is the eternal recurrence of the same, with a nod to Nietzsche. It's something that happens over and over again. And so instead of the individual manifestations of things, individual leaves, individual tables and chairs, individual people, individual events, individual historical events, in other words, those things don't matter except insofar as they manifest what is eternal, what is outside of time, and what is in, to put it in anthropological terms, and again with a nod to someone like Mircea Eliade, mythic time, mythic space. In other words, the space that you inhabit in the religion itself. So in ancient Greek polytheism, as was the case with traditional societies writ large, what mattered was what was archetypal, the maintenance of and the participation in, the somehow mystic participation in, participation mystique. So we hear that not only in anthropology later, but also with Plato. There's this problem of participation. How does one participate in the forms? How do we partake of the forms? How do we manifest the eternal? There's this bizarre relationship where we have temporal bodies, temporal individuals, temporal events and things in history, in time, but somehow those things manifest what is outside of time. And so the idea of a horse, the idea of a table, the idea of a person, the idea of the good and of justice, those things are outside of time. And so while they may have individual manifestations that are just, that are good, that are people and tables and chairs and horses inside of time, in fact, what matters to polytheistic society is what is outside of time and what is eternal. So now why does this matter for Plato? Because if we just look at the Platonic forms and we just look at the story of the Platonic forms and say, okay, you've got this great chain of being, and Plato says that, ideas and math and that sort of stuff, all that has more being than a person or individual things. And everybody kind of goes, huh, that's strange. and then moves on. That's a mistake. We need to understand this in its cultural context. In other words, Plato's philosophy was very much one that was in consonant with polytheism. And so we might even go as far as saying that Plato is the last great polytheist, insofar as the forms are themselves like gods. Now, it's not really that way, it's not quite that way, but Plato provides us with a kind of middle ground in between Homeric polytheism and what was to come later in terms of the shift to the interiority of the individual, the soul actually meaning something and able to have moral qualities, which, by the way, didn't happen until the time of Pythagoras. So with Homer, the Homeric shades that wandered the underworld, they weren't really individuals. These aren't, the damned wandering in hell or something like that. That's not what's going on there. They're not full people. They're just shades, as if shadows of people. And those are things that have less reality. And so for Plato, what has even less reality than an individual manifestation is a copy of an individual manifestation. Something that its being depends upon the individual manifestation. In other words, my shadow. My shadow can exist without me, and so my shadow has less reality than my body. But my body has less reality than the idea of body and the idea of human. So you see, this is how the scale works. So things at the lower end depend on their being. So their very existence depends on what is higher than themselves. In other words, we can say, and in fact he does say, that everything is a child of the good. So we have this child of dynamic that we're going to hear later on in Christianity. And this is not a coincidence. I'm not trying to say that Plato was a Christian. Of course, that's impossible. We have centuries worth of separation, right? But I would say that the early church fathers, and for the first millennium of Christianity's history, it was very Platonic. And so Plato's philosophy is something that is peculiarly compatible with Christianity because Christianity grew up in an environment that was shot through with Plato's philosophy. So we shouldn't be too surprised that as the Stoics, who were contemporaries with the Christians, the earliest Christians, they ennobled someone like Socrates, looked up to someone like Socrates. Well, so did Plato. And that ideal was passed down to them in the form especially of Plato's dialogues. So it's not a coincidence. It was all throughout the culture. That was where Christianity grew up. And this is something that they were conscious of. There were some who were willing to say, I wish I could call him Saint Socrates, wrote one monk. Those are pretty strong words, right? We hear this again with Meister Eckhart, who is my research emphasis, in the 13th and early 14th centuries, where he calls Plato that great priest, der große Pfaffe. Also, very, very strong praise, almost heretical, one might be willing to say. Does that border on heresy, calling someone like an obvious pagan, someone who had to be a pagan centuries before Christ, like Plato, like Socrates? Open questions, but nevertheless, I want to draw just how strong a tie there is between Plato and what would come later in Christianity, in saying that it grew up, and they grew up indeed in the same environment, such that the Neoplatonists, for instance, as they're called, although they certainly just thought of themselves as Platonists, Iamblichus and Porphyry and others of the kind, they were growing up in the same environment, in the same culture as Christianity. And so it's just that they identified more strongly with, of course, the academy, Plato's school. They were the continuation of it until it was shut down, but also Platonic philosophy. And they saw themselves as just straightforward Platonists without having a specific tie to Christianity. So the way that I put this when I'm doing this diagram in class and describing things to people is to say, okay, look, the good is on top. The good is the supreme of all of the forms, such that everything depends upon goodness for its existence. What is good is maximally existent. Now, one of the consequences of this, and we hear about this in the Parmenides, which is another one of Plato's dialogues, is that evil is not actually a form. So evil doesn't have positive existence, and that's Plato's theodicy. So this is how Plato describes evil and accounts for evil in the world, is that it is a lack of being. So something that is evil is less than, and literally has less existence than something that is good. And good is understood in terms of virtue. So virtue in arete, I mean, this is the topic of the Meno, and so I'll save that discussion for the more detailed discussion of the Meno. But suffice to say, virtue was, for the ancient Greeks, arete was an excellence. And so insofar as something was an excellent thing, it had more existence. It's almost as though, picture a carpenter who is creating a table. And as the table is taking shape and it's like sort of there, or maybe a sculptor, it's sort of there, but not quite. It's just an inchoate form. It doesn't really have the full existence that it's going to have. It's not totally a table. It's not totally the kind of thing that it's going to be when the artisan is finished. And that's ultimately what Plato is pointing to. That's the way that they thought about these things, and that's the way that virtue was understood, was as an excellence of soul. It was an excellence for a human. It was what it meant for a human to be excellent. So that's this is the divided line. This is the story with the forms. There are a couple of other elements here. One is that mathematics was included as an ideal inside of the forms. And I say ideal, idea, it's all related. This is the second reason that I alluded to earlier. So the first is polytheism, the second is mathematics. So mathematics is another one of those things where if I'm counting 1, 2, 3, those numbers don't really necessarily have anything to do with the physical reality of the things that I'm counting, right? I don't know, that's kind of an open question in philosophy of mathematics, but go with me here because this is what Plato thought. So those things don't have anything to do with the numbers themselves. They are manifestations of that particular number and may manifest certain laws, such that any given triangle that we draw is going to manifest certain laws, and he would have known about things like the Pythagorean theorem, and we'll see this in the Meno. So mathematics, then, is a species of the eternal. Insofar as we are learning mathematics, we are learning eternal truths, and so these are things that are higher. They have more being, and this creates a kind of strange situation for us where a mathematical thing, an equation, or a mathematical law literally has more being than individual manifestations of things. It's not normally the way that we think about these things, but this is the way that it worked for Plato. And this, I think, more fully explains why it is that we had at least the legendary, inscription above the doorway to the academy, let no one who has not studied geometry enter here. So Plato thought very highly of mathematics. You need to study math before you can do philosophy. And if math gives you eternal truths, and that is a kind of, paradigm for what it is that you should be doing in terms of attaining to knowledge, attaining to truth and virtue, there you go. It makes sense that we should study math first, because that is a kind of model for the sort of study, the sort of knowledge, and the sort of virtue that we're ultimately going to try to attain to. Now, I put virtue in there. That's a little weird. We don't normally think about that with math. But this is the way that Plato thought about it. So virtue was knowledge. Knowledge was virtue. To know was to be virtuous. And so if I come to knowledge, then I become better. And so there was a very strong sense, and we're going to see this with especially Aristotle, that he didn't agree with this. There was a very strong sense that if I learn, if I come to know something, then I am better. That's it. I can't unsee what I have seen. I've learned it, and I become better for it. So in other words, for Plato, it's not going to be possible for someone to willingly do evil. The only time that they can do evil is if they are ignorant. And so evil and bad actions, bad behavior, a lack of virtue in someone is quite literally ignorance. It is something that indicates and is a sign of, a surefire sign for Plato of ignorance. And so Socrates then, in being a physician of the soul, was trying to help the souls of his interlocutors and now his readers to become better. How do you become better? Well, if ignorance is the lack of being that we're trying to get rid of and to go beyond insofar as we approach the eternal forms and go up in the sliding scale of being, along the great chain of being, then there you go. It makes sense that philosophy is going to be able to help us to do that. Now, what's interesting, and I've alluded to this a few times, and this doesn't get a lot of discussion, unfortunately, in Platonic circles, beauty is the vehicle. And so beauty carries us up to the divine. In other words, beauty could be understood writ large in terms of a kind of motivation. Beauty gives us a motion, and that motion is useful for Plato insofar as it carries us up, or has the tendency to carry us up toward the divine, which is why he speaks of beauty in the sense of, okay, you begin with the most obvious thing, and he goes right to it because everybody's always thinking of this: beautiful bodies, so beautiful people. Yes, okay, that gives us a preparatory, that is a nice propedeutic. It is a nice preparatory exercise for beauty, but we must go beyond that. We must learn beauty beyond that and go to find other beautiful things and learn about beauty beyond simple beautiful bodies, and learn then about elegance. And this is why the talk of something like elegance in mathematics and beauty in mathematics, Plato would have been all over this. It's like, yes, absolutely, that's the way that we should think about it. It needs to be beautiful for us. It needs to be beautiful insofar as that provides us with the motion, the motivation to actually get moving in the right direction, in other words, up the great chain of being along the forms.